Everyone laughed when the black waitress sang, until the billionaire stood up in tears. The mockery turned to stunned silence as he approached the stage with trembling hands. Her voice had awakened memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The ballroom at the Belmont Country Club gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each facet reflecting wealth that Mary Johnson could scarcely imagine possessing. She navigated between tables with practiced precision, balancing silver trays laden with champagne flutes. Her shoulders ached from the 8-hour shift, but her smile remained fixed, professional, pleasant, and entirely invisible to the guests she served. Mary's dark uniform blended with the shadows as New York's elite celebrated another charity gala that would cost more than her annual salary. She moved like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates, her existence acknowledged only when someone needed something. The cacophony of privilege, laughter, deal-making, and self-congratulation washed over her as she worked. "You there, waitress!" A red-faced man in a tailored tuxedo beckoned her with a sloppy wave. His companions snickered as Mary approached. "We need some entertainment. Management says the staff has hidden talents." His words slurred together, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Before Mary could politely decline, other guests joined in. "Yes, let's see what she can do." A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears clapped her hands. The DJ, catching the commotion, dimmed the music and pointed a spotlight in Mary's direction. "I don't perform," Mary whispered, but her protest was drowned by encouraging shouts. Her manager appeared beside her, whispering harshly, "Just do something quick. These people donate thousands to the club." Trembling hands placed the tray on a nearby table as Mary was ushered toward the small stage. Laughter rippled through the marble hall, bouncing off gilded mirrors and expensive artwork. She felt naked under their stares, stripped of dignity, a circus animal commanded to perform. Mary closed her eyes, blocking out the smirking faces. In that darkness, she found herself back in Louisiana, sitting on her grandmother's porch as cicadas hummed in the heavy evening air. The memory washed over her, Grandma Belle's weathered hands smoothing her hair, her voice soft but strong, singing a lullaby passed down through generations. Taking a deep breath, Mary opened her mouth. The first notes emerged tentatively, barely audible above the clinking glasses and muffled giggles. The Creole words felt strange on her tongue after so many years of silence, but with each syllable, her voice grew steadier. The melody carried a haunting ache, a story of loss and perseverance, of roots deeper than pain. It was a song born from suffering, yet somehow transcendent, old as the land itself. Mary kept her eyes closed, afraid to see the mockery she expected, unaware that the room had begun to still, caught in the spell of a voice that carried generations of memory in every note. The first notes wavered in the air, uncertain and delicate. Several guests exchanged amused glances, champagne glasses poised mid-sip as they waited for the inevitable embarrassment to unfold. A woman in diamonds whispered behind her hand, and nearby, a banker's chuckle rippled through the front tables. Mary Johnson felt their judgment like a physical weight, but something shifted as she closed her eyes. The melody found its footing, growing from a tentative whisper into something rich and sorrowful. Her voice deepened, carrying decades of unspoken pain, as if channeling voices from Louisiana bayous long forgotten. "She's actually good," someone murmured, surprise evident in their tone. The waitress's hands, which had been trembling moments before, now hung relaxed at her sides. Each verse flowed more confidently than the last, building toward a chorus that made the crystal chandeliers seem to vibrate in sympathy. When she transitioned into Creole, the ancient words hung in the perfumed air like incense, unfamiliar, yet somehow universally understood. The laughter had completely died now. Forks paused midway to mouths. Conversations evaporated. Even the servers stood transfixed, trays balanced precariously as they listened. In the center of the room, at the head table adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, John Smith sat motionless. The real estate titan, whose birthday celebration this lavish event marked, stared at Mary with an expression of dawning recognition. His weathered face, usually composed in businesslike neutrality, began to crumble. Without warning, he pushed back his chair and stood. The white linen napkin slipped from his lap, forgotten, as it drifted to the marble floor. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks, catching the light as they fell. His shoulders, always squared against the world, trembled visibly beneath his tailored jacket. The crowd watched in astonishment as one of New York's most powerful men broke down completely, undone by a simple Creole lullaby. Something ancient and broken inside him had responded to the song, a memory perhaps, or a wound never properly healed. For several heartbeats, the entire ballroom seemed suspended in time. The wealthy guests, the staff, the musicians, all held their breath collectively. The only movement came from John's tears and Mary's gently swaying form as she finished the final, haunting phrase. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound more powerful than any applause could have been. No one saw Mary Johnson slip away after the final note faded into the stunned silence of the Belmont Country Club ballroom. She retreated quickly through the service door, her heart hammering against her ribs, hands trembling as she pressed them against the cool metal of the kitchen counter. What had possessed her to sing like that? To expose herself so completely to a room full of strangers who moments before had been laughing at her? Behind her, the kitchen door burst open. The restaurant manager stormed in, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Mary, what the hell was that? Mr. Smith is demanding to speak with you, right now." She shook her head, panic rising in her throat. "I can't. Please, I need to finish my shift." "This isn't a request," the manager hissed, lowering his voice as other kitchen staff pretended not to listen. "He's the guest of honor, and he's insisting. Do you want to lose your job?" Before Mary could respond, John Smith himself appeared in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. The real estate titan's weathered face still bore traces of tears, his normally commanding presence softened by something that looked like desperation. "Everyone out," he ordered, his voice quiet, but brooking no argument. The kitchen staff scattered, leaving Mary alone with him in the cramped space. "I'm sorry if I ruined your party," she began, eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You didn't ruin anything," John said, his voice gentler than she expected. "That song, I haven't heard it in over 30 years. Mary's eyes darted up to meet his. "It's just an old lullaby." "No," he insisted, taking a step closer. "It's not just anything. That melody, those Creole words." His voice cracked slightly. "I knew someone once who sang it exactly that way." She clutched the edge of the counter behind her, feeling trapped. "Many people in Louisiana know old songs like that." John studied her face intently, searching for something. His hands were trembling now too, and Mary noticed how his expensive suit couldn't hide the vulnerability suddenly evident in his posture. "Where did you learn that lullaby?" he asked, his question carrying the weight of decades. Mary swallowed hard. "My grandmother taught me. It's nothing special." "You're lying," he said, not unkindly. "I can see it in your eyes. That song, the way you sang it, it awakened something I've tried to forget for half my life." The waitress stood frozen, caught between flight and a strange magnetic pull toward this man who seemed to recognize something in her that she'd buried long ago. "Please," John whispered, "where did you learn that song?" The morning after the gala, Mary Johnson arrived at work to find her coworkers huddled in small groups, conversations dying as she passed. Their eyes followed her, some curious, others envious, a few suspicious. No longer invisible, she felt exposed under their scrutiny. "So you're a singer now?" asked Tina from the bar, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Keeping secrets from us all this time? Mary shook her head, focusing on folding napkins. It was nothing, just an old song I remembered. Before Tina could press further, Richard Dawson, the restaurant manager, beckoned Mary to his office. His face was tight with displeasure. "You created quite a scene last night," he said, leaning against his desk. "We don't hire waitstaff to perform. This isn't some cabaret." The manager's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Our clientele expects professionalism, not spectacles. One more incident like that, and you'll be looking for employment elsewhere." Mary's throat constricted. She needed this job. The rent on her modest apartment wasn't forgiving. "It won't happen again," she promised quietly. The next afternoon, John Smith walked through the restaurant doors, commanding attention without effort. He requested Mary's section specifically. The manager's demeanor shifted instantly from stern to obsequious. "Of course, Mr. Smith, right this way." Mary served him with trembling hands, avoiding his gaze. But John was persistent, asking gentle questions between courses. Where had she learned that song? Had she performed professionally before? Each inquiry brushed against memories she'd locked away years ago. "I'm just a waitress," she insisted, refilling his water glass. "No one is just anything," the real estate titan replied softly. He returned the following week, and the week after that, each time requesting her section, leaving generous tips that made her coworkers even more curious. The pattern continued for nearly a month, John appearing, asking questions that seemed innocuous, but somehow reached into the darkest corners of her past. "Did you ever visit Louisiana?" he asked one rainy Tuesday. Mary nearly dropped her tray. "How did you—" "Your accent comes through when you sing," he explained. "Reminds me of someone I knew once." With each conversation, Mary felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. The wounds she'd buried, dreams abandoned, a child given away, a name changed, a voice silenced, began to throb with renewed pain. Yet somehow, speaking with John also brought a strange relief, like lancing an old infection. "You can't keep running forever," he told her during his 5th visit, his eyes kind but knowing. Mary looked away. "I stopped running years ago. I just stopped everything." In the stillness of her modest apartment, Mary Johnson sat by the window, watching raindrops trace jagged paths down the glass. The evening light cast long shadows across her small living space, a far cry from the stages she'd once dreamed of illuminating. Her fingers absently traced the worn wooden sill as she began to hum, the melody rising unbidden from somewhere deep within. The song started as a whisper, then grew stronger as Mary closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly sing in private, without fear or restraint. Each note brought back flashes of smoky jazz clubs in Louisiana, the weight of sequin dresses against her skin, and the electric thrill of applause washing over her. The memories were bittersweet, like pressing on an old bruise, painful yet somehow necessary. "I thought I buried that girl," she murmured to the empty room, her voice catching. But something had awakened in her since that night at the Belmont. The waitress found herself remembering melodies she'd forced herself to forget, lyrics rising to her lips during quiet moments between serving tables. 3 days later, the restaurant was nearly empty when the afternoon rain drove in a handful of customers seeking shelter. Mary noticed a young woman sitting alone, nursing a cup of coffee long after finishing her meal. As she cleared nearby tables, the waitress hummed absently, unaware she had an audience, until she turned to find the stranger watching her intently. "That melody," the woman said, her eyes bright with interest. "It's beautiful." Mary nodded politely, attempting to move away, but the customer stood, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Davis. I teach music at the community college," she explained, her smile warm and genuine. "Your voice has something special, a quality that's becoming rare these days." The waitress felt heat rise to her cheeks as she reluctantly shook Sarah's hand. There was something familiar in the young teacher's features that made Mary uncomfortable. "Would you consider letting me record you? Just one song? For archival purposes, I'm documenting traditional Creole melodies before they're lost. The request hit Mary like a physical blow. The cup she was holding trembled slightly in her hand. Recording meant evidence, permanence, exposure, everything she'd been running from since leaving Louisiana. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes darting toward the kitchen, seeking escape. "I don't sing, not really. It's just old habits." Sarah looked disappointed but nodded respectfully. "I understand, but if you change your mind," she placed a business card on the table before gathering her things. As the young woman left, Mary pocketed the card without examining it, unaware that the rain-soaked encounter had just connected her to the daughter she'd given up 28 years before. Sarah Davis couldn't stay away from the restaurant. Something about Mary Johnson's voice called to her, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. 3 times that week, she requested Mary's section, watching the waitress move between tables with quiet efficiency, occasionally humming fragments of songs under her breath. "You have a gift," Sarah told her on a quiet Tuesday evening, the restaurant nearly empty as closing time approached. "I've studied music my entire life, and I've never heard anything like your voice." Mary wiped down the neighboring table, her eyes fixed on her task. "It's nothing special, just old songs my grandmother taught me." "Would you tell me about her?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee. "About your family." Mary hesitated, then sat down across from the young music teacher. There was something in Sarah's earnest expression that broke through her usual caution. "I don't talk about the past much," Mary admitted, "but I suppose some stories need telling." Sarah nodded, leaning forward. "I understand more than you might think. I've been searching for my own history." Her fingers traced the edge of her napkin. "I was adopted as a baby. My parents were wonderful, but there's always been this emptiness." Mary's expression softened. "That must be difficult." "They left me a music box when they passed," Sarah continued. "It plays the most beautiful melody, Creole, I think. And there was a note saying my birth mother was a singer from Louisiana." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, the ambient noise fading as Mary's focus narrowed to Sarah's words. "The adoption agency had almost nothing," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just that she was young, talented, and the year, I was born in 1985. The heavy serving tray in Mary's hands suddenly slipped through nerveless fingers. It hit the tile floor with a deafening crash, water glasses shattering and ice scattering across the floor. Mary stood frozen, her face drained of color. "I'm so sorry." Sarah jumped up, grabbing napkins. "Let me help." "No." Mary's voice was barely audible. "It's fine. I'll handle it." But her hands trembled violently as she knelt to gather the broken glass. The year 1985 wasn't just a date. It was the dividing line of her life, the moment everything changed. The moment she'd given away her newborn daughter and buried Josephine Bell forever. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, genuine concern in her eyes. "You're shaking." Mary nodded, unable to speak, the ache in her chest threatening to break open decades of carefully constructed walls. This young woman with kind eyes and musical talent couldn't possibly be. "I should go," Mary managed, rising unsteadily to her feet. "It's getting late." The restaurant lights dimmed as the last customers filtered out. Mary Johnson wiped down tables mechanically, her mind elsewhere as she worked through her closing routine. John Smith sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a glass of whiskey, his expensive suit jacket draped over the chair beside him. "Stay for a coffee?" he asked as she approached. His voice carried a gentleness that contrasted with his powerful public persona. Mary hesitated before sliding into the seat across from him. The restaurant was empty now, just the two of them, and the distant clatter of kitchen staff. "I wasn't always this," John confessed, gesturing vaguely at himself. "Before the buildings and board meetings, I was just a scared kid running from my father." He told her about 1984, when he'd fled his family's suffocating expectations. His father, a ruthless businessman, had mapped out John's entire life. The right schools, the right wife, the right career path. At 22, he'd packed a single bag and disappeared to New Orleans. I had nothing, he continued, eyes fixed on some distant memory. Slept on couches, worked odd jobs. Then one night, I wandered into this little jazz club off Bourbon Street. Mary's fingers tightened around her mug as John described meeting Josephine Bell, a young singer whose voice could make time stand still. His face softened as he recalled their whirlwind romance, living in a tiny apartment above a bakery, planning impossible futures together. Then one morning, she was gone, he said, voice breaking slightly. No note, no goodbye, just an empty closet and a demo tape on the nightstand. He pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. I've carried this for 35 years. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at her younger self, smiling from the faded image, the same photograph she'd destroyed every copy of except one. My father found me, John continued, told me he'd made sure she'd never come back. I returned to New York, took my place in the family business, married Jennifer, but I never stopped looking for Josephine. Mary sat frozen, memories flooding back, the threats, the money pushed across a table by John's father, the promise she'd made to disappear forever or watch John's life be systematically destroyed. I thought she might be dead, he whispered, eyes glistening. Mary's throat constricted. She'd been Josephine Bell once, young, talented, desperately in love, before fear transformed her into Mary Johnson, a woman who never sang, who made herself invisible. John, she finally managed, her voice barely audible. I know what happened to her. Mary Johnson sat across from John Smith in the empty restaurant, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee. The weight of decades pressed down on her shoulders as she finally allowed the walls she'd built to crumble. I had your child, John, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the kitchen's refrigerator. A beautiful baby girl I had to give up. John's face drained of color. He reached for the table's edge to steady himself, knocking over a salt shaker in the process. The white granules scattered across the tabletop like tiny fragments of their shattered past. When? He managed to ask, his voice hoarse. After you left Louisiana, your father found me, Mary explained, her eyes focused on the spilled salt. He said he'd destroy us both if I didn't disappear. I was 22, alone and terrified. I believed him. The real estate titan's hands trembled as the full impact of her words hit him. All these years, he'd believed Josephine, Mary, had simply abandoned their love, when in reality, she'd been protecting them from his father's ruthless influence. I gave birth in a small clinic outside New Orleans, she continued, each word visibly painful. They took her immediately. I wasn't even allowed to name her. John covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The guilt of his ignorance crushed him. While he'd been building his empire, the woman he loved had faced an impossible choice alone. I promised myself I would never sing again, Mary said, wiping away a tear. It reminded me too much of what we lost, of who I used to be, until that night at the Belmont. The businessman looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. We have to find her, our daughter. Mary shook her head slowly. The adoption was closed. I signed away my rights. I have resources now, John insisted, reaching across the table to take her hand. Things my father could never imagine. For the first time in decades, they allowed themselves to grieve together. For the young lovers they once were, for the family they might have been, for all the birthdays and milestones lost to time and circumstance. I never stopped loving you, John confessed, his voice breaking. Even when I thought you'd left me. Mary squeezed his hand, the calluses from years of carrying trays meeting the smooth skin of privilege. And I never stopped hearing your music in my head, she admitted. Every day, every night. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the New York streets clean, as two broken hearts began the delicate process of finding their way back to each other, and perhaps to the daughter they had lost. Sarah Davis couldn't sleep that night after hearing Mary's voice at the Belmont Country Club. The haunting Creole melody followed her home, weaving through her dreams like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. For days afterward, she found herself humming the tune, feeling an inexplicable connection that went beyond musical appreciation. "I've heard this before," she whispered to herself one evening, sitting at her kitchen table. The music teacher had spent years collecting folk songs, but this particular melody felt personal, intimate, like a half-remembered conversation. With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed her adoptive mother. "Mom, that music box from my birth family, where did you put it when we moved?" 3 hours later, she was kneeling on her bedroom floor, carefully opening the ornate wooden box she hadn't touched in years. Her adoptive parents had given it to her on her 18th birthday, explaining it was the only item that came with her during the adoption. The key turned stiffly in the tarnished lock. When the lid creaked open, the mechanism inside slowly began to turn. Notes trickled out, hesitant at first, then flowing into the exact lullaby she'd heard Mary sing. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. It wasn't coincidence or imagination. The song that had haunted her for weeks was literally her birthright. Beneath the music box's velvet lining, she found what she'd forgotten was there, a faded sepia photograph. A young woman stood on a small stage, microphone in hand, her face illuminated with passion. She wore a simple dress, but her presence commanded attention. On the back, written in faded blue ink, "Josephine Bell, Blue Bayou, 1984. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. The woman in the photograph, her high cheekbones, the curve of her smile, the way she held herself, was unmistakably Mary Johnson. Older now, worn by time and hardship, but undeniably the same person. "My mother," she whispered, tracing the outline of Josephine's face with her fingertip. The realization washed over her in waves, each bringing clarity and confusion in equal measure. Why had Mary become a waitress? Why had she given Sarah up? What connected her to John Smith, whose tears had flowed so freely at the gala? The truth hovered tantalizingly close, simultaneously terrifying and electrifying. Sarah clutched the photograph to her chest, the music box still playing its gentle melody. She was both afraid to learn more and desperate for answers. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to the restaurant. This time, she wouldn't just ask Mary to sing. She would find out who Josephine Bell was and why her lullaby had traveled across time to bring them together. The lawsuit arrived on Mary Johnson's doorstep like a death sentence. Her former manager, Curtis, had been fuming since John began frequenting the restaurant, effectively undermining his authority with both staff and ownership. The legal documents cited workplace disruption and character concerns. But Mary knew the real target, her carefully buried past. "He's threatening to contact every tabloid in New York," she told John, her hands trembling as they sat in her small apartment. "There are things I've never told anyone, not even you, things from after I left Louisiana." John reached across the table, his weathered fingers closing over hers. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." But the rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of drug addiction, abandoned children, and fraudulent identities circulated through the restaurant industry. Mary watched helplessly as coworkers who once smiled now avoided eye contact, their judgment palpable in the cramped kitchen spaces. "I can't do this," she confessed to John one evening, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah has just found me. If she learns everything, the desperate things I did to survive, she'll want nothing to do with me." The real estate titan sat quietly, his normally commanding presence softened by concern. After a long moment, he made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. The next morning, John Smith called a press conference outside his corporate headquarters. Cameras flashed as he stood at the podium, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to do. 25 years ago, I abandoned a woman I loved because I was too weak to stand up to my father, he began. Every hardship she has endured since then, every struggle, every moment of pain is my responsibility alone. He detailed how his family had threatened Josephine Bell, how they'd used their influence to blacklist her from performing, how his own cowardice had forced her to remake herself as Mary Johnson. The reporters scribbled frantically, stunned by the billionaire's public confession. By evening, John's company stock had plummeted. His board demanded his resignation, and his father's remaining business partners severed ties immediately. The last piece of his family empire crumbled before his eyes. When Mary called him, frantic about what he'd done, John simply said, "For once in my life, I'm not running away." A lawsuit disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, Curtis's revenge plot overshadowed by John's dramatic confession. But the cost was immense. John Smith, once counted among New York's wealthiest men, had sacrificed everything to protect Mary from facing her past alone. Word of Mary Johnson's extraordinary performance at the Belmont Country Club spread like wildfire through New York's tight-knit music community. What began as whispers among waitstaff evolved into passionate discussions in recording studios and university music departments. Her haunting Creole lullaby had awakened something in those who heard it, a hunger for authenticity in a world of manufactured sound. Sarah Davis saw an opportunity. For months, she had been researching forgotten Creole musical traditions for her doctoral thesis, and Mary's performance aligned perfectly with her academic passion. The music teacher organized a tribute concert at a small but respected venue in Greenwich Village, featuring artists who preserved the musical heritage Mary had inadvertently showcased. "Please come," Sarah begged during one of her now regular visits to the restaurant. "This music is part of your heritage. The artists would be honored to meet someone who carries these traditions so naturally." Her eyes shone with enthusiasm. Unaware she was pleading with her own mother, Mary wiped her hands on her apron, avoiding Sarah's gaze. The thought of being recognized, of standing before an audience intentionally, made her stomach clench. Yet something about Sarah's earnestness made refusal difficult. "I don't belong on stage," she said softly. "That part of my life is gone." "You don't have to perform," Sarah insisted. "Just be there. Listen. Connect." John Smith, seated at his usual table, watched their interaction with quiet intensity. Since discovering Mary's true identity, he'd become protective, often intervening when conversations veered too close to her past. But this time, he remained silent, sensing the importance of this mother-daughter exchange, even if Sarah remained unaware of the connection. After 3 days of gentle persistence, Mary finally agreed, but with firm conditions. "I'll come, but I won't be announced. No introductions, no spotlight. If I share anything, it will be just my voice, nothing more." Sarah nodded eagerly, thrilled at the small victory. She rushed off to finalize arrangements, leaving Mary and John alone. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, concern etching his weathered face. Mary smoothed her uniform, a simple gesture that betrayed her anxiety. "No," she admitted, "but I can't keep hiding from who I was, from the music." She didn't add what they both knew, that she couldn't keep hiding from their daughter either. As Sarah disappeared through the restaurant door, Mary felt a strange mixture of terror and hope. The thought of music, real music, not just accidental moments, returning to her life was like contemplating reunion with a beloved friend who had witnessed her greatest shame. But perhaps, she thought, watching her daughter's enthusiastic departure, some broken things could be mended after all. The concert hall buzzed with nervous energy as Sarah Davis paced backstage, her phone pressed to her ear. The final performer had called in sick, something about food poisoning, leaving a 20-minute gap in the program that threatened to derail the entire tribute to forgotten Creole artists. "What am I going to do?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Her eyes darted around until they landed on Mary Johnson, who stood quietly in the shadows of the wings, watching the proceedings with a mixture of pride and trepidation. Sarah approached her birth mother, though neither yet knew their true connection, with desperation in her eyes. "Mary, please, I know you didn't want to perform, but we need someone. The audience is waiting, and your voice." She trailed off, gesturing helplessly toward the stage. Mary's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I haven't performed in public for decades, not since—" She stopped herself, memories of Louisiana stages and smoky jazz clubs threatening to overwhelm her. "Just one song," Sarah pleaded, taking Mary's weathered hands in her own. "No introduction, no spotlight on your face if you don't want it. Just your voice." The waitress looked past Sarah to the stage, where the previous performer was taking her final bow. The applause seemed to echo through time, reminding her of another life, another name. Josephine Bell, a name she had buried along with her dreams and her child. "One song," Mary finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. Minutes later, she stood at the edge of the darkened stage. The audience murmured in confusion as an unannounced figure emerged from the wings. Mary wore no stage makeup, no fancy dress, just the simple black pants and white blouse she'd arrived in. The spotlight operator, unsure what to do, cast only a soft glow that left her face in partial shadow. Mary closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The first notes were tentative, almost fragile, but as the melody took shape, her voice gained strength. It was the same lullaby she had sung at the Belmont Country Club, the one that had broken John Smith's composure and set this whole chain of events in motion. The audience fell silent, captivated. Mary's voice carried decades of pain, loss, and resilience. It spoke of Louisiana bayous, of love abandoned, of a child given up. Though she sang in Creole, the emotion transcended language, reaching into the hearts of everyone present. In that moment, Mary wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't even Mary. She was Josephine Bell again, the woman she had locked away for so long, finally free to sing her truth. Midway through the song, John Smith appeared at the edge of the stage, his presence solid and reassuring against the backdrop of hushed spectators. The real estate titan who had lost everything that once defined him now found himself drawn to the melody that had first connected them decades ago. Mary's voice hung in the air, each note carrying the weight of their shared history. Without a word, John stepped onto the stage, his footsteps barely audible over the gentle piano accompaniment. He took Mary's hand in his, the simple gesture bridging years of separation. His other hand trembled visibly as he found the keys of the piano, joining the accompaniment with halting but sincere notes. The audience watched, transfixed, as the wealthy businessman who once commanded boardrooms now served the music with humble reverence. Mary's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't falter. Her voice grew stronger with his presence beside her, as though his return completed something long broken inside her. The former jazz singer allowed herself to lean slightly toward him, their shoulders touching in a moment of silent reconciliation. From the wings, Sarah Davis watched the scene unfold, her hand pressed against her chest. The music teacher felt something shift deep inside her, a recognition that transcended understanding. The melody called to her blood, to memories she couldn't possibly possess, yet somehow knew intimately. The lullaby that had haunted her dreams since childhood now pulled her forward with magnetic force. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah stepped onto the stage, drawn by an instinct older than reason. Her voice, tentative at first, rose to join theirs, creating a harmony so perfect it sent shivers through the audience. The three voices intertwined, creating something greater than any could achieve alone. Mary turned toward the sound, her eyes meeting Sarah's. In that moment of connection, tears streamed freely down her face as she sang with her daughter for the first time. John's fingers steadied on the keys, finding strength in the completion of their broken circle. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt whole, the emptiness that had followed her through childhood, through every achievement and milestone, finally filled with something warm and certain. She didn't yet understand the full truth of who stood beside her, but her soul recognized what her mind did not. She was singing with her parents, her voice completing a harmony 28 years in the making. The three figures on stage, illuminated by soft lights, created a tableau of healing that transcended the music itself. They were no longer performer and audience, but witnesses to something sacred, a family finding its way home through song. The audience rose as one, handkerchiefs dabbing at eyes, makeup streaking down cheeks. The harmonies filling the concert venue weren't merely beautiful, they were transcendent. Mary Johnson's rich contralto formed the foundation. John Smith's baritone provided unexpected depth, and Sarah Davis's clear soprano soared above them both. Three voices, three generations, one bloodline, united by a Creole lullaby that had survived decades of silence. Mary closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her daughter's hand in hers, the solid presence of John at the piano. For the first time in years, she wasn't hiding. The waitress who had moved invisibly through rooms of the wealthy was now commanding their full attention, their respect, their tears. John's fingers trembled slightly on the keys, but his playing remained steady. He glanced up at Mary, not the frightened Josephine Bell who had disappeared from his life, but a woman who had endured, survived, and found her voice again. The real estate titan who had lost his empire found himself gaining something far more valuable with each note they shared. Sarah felt the vibrations of their voices mingling in her chest, a physical sensation of belonging she'd searched for her entire life. The music teacher who had spent years helping others find their artistic voices had finally found the source of her own. The melody they created together wasn't just music, it was DNA, it was history, it was reconciliation. As the final note hung in the air, time seemed suspended. Then the crowd erupted, their applause thunderous, their cheers deafening. People stood on chairs, whistled, shouted for more. But the three performers only had eyes for each other. Backstage, away from the roaring audience, they collapsed into each other's arms. Sarah buried her face in her mother's shoulder, inhaling the unfamiliar yet somehow known scent. Mary's tears fell freely as she cradled her daughter's head, her other arm wrapped tightly around John's waist. "I never thought," John began, his voice breaking before he could finish. "I know," Mary whispered, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "Neither did I." Sarah laughed through her tears. 28 years, she said, and now we're all here. They stood in that embrace, their breathing gradually synchronizing. The decades lost to fear, pride, and circumstance could never be reclaimed. The birthdays missed, the school concerts unattended, the holidays spent apart, all irretrievable. Yet in this moment, clutching each other in a cramped backstage room, they discovered something even more precious than what they'd lost, the possibility of tomorrow, together. The morning after the concert, Mary Johnson stared at her smartphone in horror. Splashed across the screen was her face, not as the humble waitress she'd become, but as Josephine Bell, the promising singer who'd vanished decades ago. The headline read, "Billionaire's Lost Love, the Secret Past of the Singing Waitress." She scrolled through article after article, each one more invasive than the last. They questioned everything, why she'd abandoned her career, whether she'd extorted money from John, even if Sarah was truly his daughter. One particularly vicious piece suggested she'd fabricated her entire story for financial gain. "They're making me into some kind of gold digger," Mary whispered to herself, tears welling in her eyes. Her phone buzzed with messages from coworkers sharing links to the stories, their tones ranging from concern to thinly veiled schadenfreude. Across town, John Smith faced his own battle. Jennifer Smith had summoned him to her attorney's office, her face a mask of cold fury. "You've made a spectacle of yourself," Jennifer said, sliding a document across the polished mahogany table. Our divorce settlement includes clauses about public scandal. You violated every one of them. John glanced at the papers without touching them. This is about family, not business. Family? Jennifer laughed bitterly. That waitress and her daughter are not your family. I've spoken with the board. Either you publicly deny any connection to them, or you lose everything. The remaining shares, the pension, even the summer house. His ex-wife's eyes narrowed. You built that empire for 30 years. Are you really going to throw it away for some woman who abandoned your supposed child? John felt the weight of her threat. The real estate business had been his identity for decades. Without it, who was he? That evening, Sarah Davis called Mary in tears. My principal saw the articles. Parents are complaining about having me teach their children. Her voice broke. They're saying I'm unstable because of my complicated family situation. Mary closed her eyes, the familiar weight of shame settling on her shoulders. This was why she'd hidden for so long. Her voice, once her greatest gift, had become a curse that hurt everyone around her. When John called later, Mary let it go to voicemail. She listened to his message, his voice steady but tired, as he promised to fix everything, and wondered if some broken things were better left alone. Perhaps love wasn't enough to overcome decades of secrets, shame, and social barriers. Perhaps some songs were never meant to be finished. Mary Johnson sat alone in her modest apartment, staring at the smartphone screen filled with tabloid headlines about her past. Each notification felt like another nail in the coffin of her newfound happiness. She turned the device face down on the coffee table and moved to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass. I should have known better, she whispered to the empty room. Throughout her life, whenever she dared to share her voice, chaos followed. First with John's father threatening her, then forcing her to give up Sarah, and now this media circus threatening the fragile family bonds she'd only just rediscovered. The waitress hadn't returned calls from either John or Sarah in 3 days. Their voicemails piled up, each more concerned than the last. She'd even called in sick to work, unable to face the whispers and stares from her coworkers who'd seen her face splashed across gossip sites. Mary pulled the curtains closed and sat at her small kitchen table. The silence in her apartment felt both comforting and suffocating. She hummed a few notes of the Creole lullaby, then stopped abruptly, as if the melody itself might summon more pain. Across town, Sarah Davis paced her living room, the music box open on her coffee table. The photograph of her mother as Josephine Bell stared back at her, young and vibrant on stage, so different from the withdrawn woman who now refused her calls. What if she regrets finding me? Sarah asked the empty room. The music teacher had spent years searching for her birth mother, but now that they'd found each other, she felt paralyzed by insecurity. Her adoptive parents had always supported her musical talents, but this was different. This was heritage, blood, a lineage of sound that flowed through generations. Sarah sat at her keyboard, but couldn't bring herself to play. Every note she considered felt inadequate, a pale imitation of her mother's raw emotional power. How could she possibly live up to such a gift? The pressure to honor her newly discovered roots while finding her own voice left her fingers frozen above the keys. She picked up her cell phone and tried Mary's number again, only to reach voicemail. "Mom," she said, the words still unfamiliar on her tongue. "Please call me back. We don't have to talk about music or perform or anything. I just want to know you, that's all." Sarah ended the call and looked at the photograph again. 2 women, separated by time but connected by melody, each hiding from the world for fear of not being enough. John Smith sat in his new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom that felt cavernous compared to the penthouse he'd once occupied. The walls were bare, his possessions reduced to essentials, Yet as he gazed out the window at the bustling New York streets below, he felt lighter than he had in decades. The loss of his real estate empire, the legacy his father had built through ruthless deals and broken promises, had initially terrified him. But now, watching the morning light filter through simple curtains, he recognized the freedom in starting over. He picked up his smartphone and typed a message to Mary Johnson and Sarah Davis. "Dinner tonight? I found a little Creole place downtown." Their responses came quickly, eager acceptances that made his heart swell. These connections, he realized, were worth more than all the buildings he'd ever owned. That evening, in a small restaurant with peeling paint and mismatched chairs, the three of them gathered around a table laden with gumbo, jambalaya, and fresh beignets. Mary smiled as she explained each dish, her voice warming as she shared stories of her grandmother's kitchen in Louisiana. She'd sing while stirring the roux, she said, demonstrating the slow circular motion. Said the rhythm kept the spirits happy. Sarah leaned forward, absorbing every word, every gesture. "Did you sing in the kitchen too?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Mary hesitated, then nodded. "Every day until I left. Music was as much a part of cooking as salt and pepper." John watched them, these two remarkable women he'd almost lost forever. "Could you teach us?" he asked softly. "Not just the recipes, but the songs too?" The waitress looked startled, then thoughtful. "I could try," she finally said. Over the following weeks, they established a ritual. Twice a week, they gathered in Mary's apartment, where she taught them to make roux, to season crawfish, to feel the music in everyday movements. John learned to play simple accompaniments on a second-hand keyboard he'd purchased, while Sarah's clear voice blended with her mother's in harmonies that made the tiny rooms vibrate with joy. They shared prayers before meals, not the formal invocations of John's childhood, but grateful murmurings that honored ancestors and welcomed the future. They exchanged stories, painful ones, joyful ones, ordinary moments that somehow seemed sacred when shared. Slowly, they were weaving something new from threads that had been violently torn apart years ago. Not a restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something stronger, more beautiful for having been broken. The Bowery Music Hall buzzed with anticipation as Sarah Davis made final adjustments to her setlist backstage. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned a small brooch, a gift from Mary, to her dress collar. This performance wasn't just her debut. It was a reclamation of heritage, a bridge between worlds that had been separated for too long. "5 minutes, Ms. Gavis," the stage manager called, peeking through the curtain. Sarah nodded, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. For weeks, she had immersed herself in her mother's musical traditions, blending Creole rhythms with contemporary arrangements. Each song represented a fragment of the story she was only beginning to understand. Her story. When the lights dimmed and the audience hushed, Sarah stepped onto the stage with practiced confidence. Her first 3 songs flowed beautifully, her voice strong and clear as it filled the intimate venue. Critics scribbled notes, their expressions unreadable in the darkness beyond the stage lights. But halfway through her 4th song, a reimagined version of the lullaby that had first connected her to Mary, something shifted. The weight of expectation, of history, of belonging and not belonging, suddenly crashed down upon her shoulders. Her voice faltered on a high note, then trailed into silence. The audience stirred uncomfortably. Sarah stood frozen, microphone clutched in her hand, the backing track continuing without her voice. Sweat beaded on her forehead as panic threatened to overtake her. She wasn't Josephine Bell. She wasn't even fully Mary Johnson's daughter yet. They were still learning each other, still healing old wounds. Who was she to claim this legacy? Her eyes desperately scanned the front rows, seeking the one face that could anchor her in this moment. Earlier, Mary had promised to attend, though she'd been hesitant about public appearances since the tabloid frenzy. John had offered to drive her, determined to support both women despite the personal cost to his reputation. But the seat Sarah had reserved for her mother appeared empty. The silence stretched painfully as the backing track faded out. Someone coughed. Another person shifted in their seat. Sarah felt the moment slipping away. Her chance to honor her roots, to prove herself worthy of the extraordinary gift she'd inherited. Then, in the back of the hall, a door opened. Light spilled briefly into the darkened room as a figure slipped inside. Though Sarah couldn't make out the face clearly, she recognized the posture, the careful way Mary Johnson moved through the world, present but trying not to disturb. Her mother had come after all. Sarah closed her eyes, found her center, and gestured to the band to restart the track. This time, when she opened her mouth to sing, her voice carried the strength of generations. Mary Johnson sat perfectly still in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The spotlight illuminated Sarah's face, revealing the moment of panic that threatened to derail everything they'd worked toward. Without hesitation, Mary rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and graceful, despite the racing of her heart. The audience murmured as she ascended the steps to the stage. Mary's presence transformed as she approached her daughter, no longer the invisible waitress, but a woman reclaiming her power. She took Sarah's trembling hand in hers, squeezing gently. "Together," she whispered, barely audible above the hush that had fallen over the crowd. Sarah's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded, finding strength in her mother's touch. Side by side, they turned to face the audience, 3 generations of music, pain, and healing embodied in their shared stance. John Smith sat at the grand piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. The real estate titan who had once commanded boardrooms with ruthless efficiency now served a different purpose. He caught Mary's eye, a silent question passing between them. She nodded, and his hands descended. The first notes of the Creole lullaby filled the venue, delicate and haunting. Mary closed her eyes, transported back to humid Louisiana nights, to a time before heartbreak had silenced her. Her voice emerged tentatively, like a bird testing damaged wings. Sarah joined next, her trained technique blending with her mother's raw emotion. The harmony they created sent shivers through the audience, the same melody, but enriched by their different journeys. John's deep baritone entered last, providing the foundation that completed their sound. His voice, unused for decades except in corporate speeches, carried the weight of regret and newfound purpose. As they moved through the verses, their confidence grew. Mary's voice soared above the others, reclaiming the power that had once made her Josephine Bell. Sarah wove intricate harmonies around the melody, bringing contemporary sensibility to ancient phrases. John's steady rhythm anchored them both, his fingers finding chords he'd forgotten he knew. The lullaby transformed in their hands, no longer just a song of comfort, but a testament to survival. Each note carried the story of separation and reunion, of secrets buried and truths revealed. The 3 voices, once isolated in their separate pains, now created something greater than any could achieve alone. In the front row, several audience members wiped away tears. Critics who had come prepared with sharp pens found themselves transported beyond judgment. The music transcended performance, becoming instead a sacred moment of healing that everyone present understood they were privileged to witness. As the final chorus approached, Mary opened her eyes and looked directly at her daughter, then at John. For the first time in decades, she sang without fear, without shame, her voice full and free, weaving past and present into something transcendent. The concert hall fell silent as the last notes of the Creole lullaby hung in the air. Unlike that night at the Belmont Country Club months ago, not a single person laughed. The critics who had come expecting to dissect technique sat with damp cheeks. The strangers who had purchased tickets on a whim found themselves holding their breath. This time, Mary Johnson's voice wasn't met with mockery, but with reverence. Sarah Davis stood center stage beside her mother. their hands intertwined, as if they'd never been separated. The young music teacher's voice complemented Mary's perfectly, two branches from the same musical root. At the piano, John Smith's fingers moved with gentle precision, his eyes never leaving the two women who had transformed his life. The waitress who had spent decades hiding her gift now stood tall, her shoulders no longer burdened by secrets. Mary's face shone with a peace that came from finally embracing who she truly was, not just Josephine Bell or Mary Johnson, but both, complete and whole. When the final note faded into silence, the audience remained motionless. A heartbeat passed. 2. Then the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears, others pressing hands to hearts. The standing ovation washed over the stage like a cleansing wave. John stepped away from the piano to join Mary and Sarah at center stage. The three joined hands and bowed together, a family portrait framed by spotlight. No lawsuit, tabloid headline, or threat from Jennifer could diminish this moment. The real estate titan who had lost his empire had gained something far more valuable. Backstage, surrounded by bouquets and well-wishers, Sarah embraced her birth parents. "I always felt something was missing," she whispered. "Now I know it was this, our music, our story." Mary touched her daughter's cheek. "I sang that lullaby every night after giving you up," she admitted. "I never thought you'd hear it again." John wrapped his arms around them both. "We have years to make up for," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and many more songs to share." As they left the venue together, a reporter approached, microphone extended. "Miss Bell, or is it Johnson? What's next for you three?" Mary looked at her daughter and the man she had once loved, still loved, and smiled. "We're just beginning to write that part," she answered. "But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The story of the waitress, the billionaire, and their long-lost daughter spread far beyond New York, touching hearts across the country. Proof that even the most broken melodies could find their way home.